Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J, and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I look at old games I haven't played before to see if they hold up. The past few reviews I've done have been surprisingly concise, so let's throw that out the window by looking at the most wordy game I can find, Planescape Torment. Heralded by many as one of, if not the best RPGs ever made, Planescape Torment was the second game to use the Infinity Engine after Baldur's Gate introduced it on a high note. Instead of doing your typical adventure, however, the story, characters, and world were so different from anything that had been seen in video games at the time that it was received really well. While it ended up not selling as well as Black Isle had hoped, it was certainly one which those who played it wouldn't forget anytime soon. The question for me was whether or not it would grab me in the same way, especially since nowadays the RPG genre has branched out in pretty much every imaginable direction. So without further ado, let's dive into it. Ordinarily for story-driven games, I like to look at the gameplay first, but since it's so tightly integrated into and informed by the story, let's start there. Welcome to Planescape, a multiverse of infinite variety, where the elements, belief, and morality itself can take on a physical form. These manifestations, called the planes, lead to many and varied worlds that can be explored, and at the center of all of these lies the City of Doors, also known as Sigil. Here, creatures and beings from across the multiverse are able to gather, trade, settle, and so on under the watchful gaze of the city's protector, the Lady of Pain. It is this city where your story primarily takes place, as you take on the role of the Nameless One. You wake up in the mortuary, a building dedicated to preserving the dead, having forgotten pretty much everything that led you to that point. Guided only by a talking skull named Mort and the cryptic tattoos written on your back, you set out to figure out who you are, what your place is in the world, and to learn more about your interesting condition. For some reason, every time you were killed, you were able to get back on your feet, though this is also what led to your memories being lost. As you travel, you will encounter creatures of all kinds and dispositions and deal with the fallout from the actions of your previous lives. That's pretty much all I can say without entering spoiler territory, and it's difficult to explain why the story works so well without spoiling everything or just repeating OMG buy it now for the next half hour. There is so much to this game that's worth seeing for yourself that it's hard to find the words to describe it. Perhaps the scale is the best place to begin. Though most of your time is spent in Sigil, the city itself has all sorts of interesting characters with their own stories to tell. Perhaps the best example of this is at the Gathering Dust Bar, a small establishment outside of the mortuary. The beliefs and traditions of the people there are vastly different from anything that you'll find in real life. But even within that largely homogenous group, there are people who doubt the traditions they've grown up with and taught, others who take the belief to an extreme that others disagree with, and so on. The world and characters are perhaps the most realistic that I've ever seen, despite this being a pseudo-fantasy setting. On top of that, there is so much within the game that is so thought-provoking. The game tackles a wide variety of subjects ranging from mortality to the nature of existence to morality to everything in between. To my surprise, it wasn't the nature of the discussion itself that was as thought-provoking as much as it was the manner in which the dialogue options were handled. Normally I don't focus too much on them, as they tend to remain fairly simple, allowing you to have a basic influence over the story with answers that are variations of yes, no, or maybe. However, while the game still relies on that primarily, the manner in which they handle them is really clever. To start, you don't always start talking with someone the moment you initiate dialogue. That sounds counterintuitive, but more often than not, you're given a small amount of time to study what a person looks like and figure out their demeanor before you actually say hello. It's a tiny way of getting around the issue of not wanting to talk to someone immediately upon seeing them, as well as getting around the technical limitation of the NPC character models being, for the most part, variations on a theme. What really makes it work, though, are when it talks about those serious subjects. For pretty much every scenario, the yes, no, or maybe options aren't just that, but rather arguments in favor of or opposed to whatever is being presented by whoever you're talking to. The best example comes from my interaction with Takan, a potential party member you find at a different bar in Sigil. He comes from a plane whose very nature is that of chaos, to a degree where even matter itself is constantly changing and shifting. In order to survive, his people, the Gitsurai, form an orderly society forged on the will to maintain the city's form. That perspective can lead to an interesting discussion about the nature of Sigil, as while it is the City of Doors, it is also closely guarded by the Lady of Pain so as to prevent what are effectively gods from messing with it. So it's the City of Doors except when it's not, which leads into an interesting discussion as to what form order should take and how it's carried out. That dialogue acts as a good example as to how a lot of the interaction takes place. Since that you're making the decision as to what to say, it gives you time to think as to how you would actually answer. The best part is that the game never forces you to take any action that you don't want to, but rather allows you to agree or disagree at pretty much every point. If you hear an argument for one belief system, here's a counter-argument that you can bring up, and how you answer will affect the Nameless One on his journey, giving you time to think about where you stand on the matter. Admittedly, you can munchkin this in order to get a certain outcome, but of all the CRPGs to power game in, this seems like the one which would be the least ideal for that. Because of all these different perspectives and possible answers, there is a huge amount of diversity between the surprisingly few characters you can have join you. Unfortunately, because of the nature of discussions surrounding diversity, I feel a degree of explanation is in order. Whenever diversity is mentioned, the focus is often on creating new and interesting stories by focusing on characters which aren't seen all that often, at least within the realm of storytelling. A similar principle applies to real life, as people with different backgrounds are going to have different opinions and outlooks, and being able to hear more of those differing viewpoints can help us improve as a whole. It's a noble goal, but one I often find is overly focused on physical characteristics, such as race and gender. Not that focusing on those characteristics is inherently bad, as it's natural for us to notice the physical differences in each other and assume there are differences that extend beyond that. But I find a pure reliance on physical traits to be inherently short-sighted. If you threw me out of my college dorm and into rural Germany, then I would stand out like a sore thumb despite being part German. By that same token, if my neighbor had similar circumstances growing up to me but just so happened to be black, then our differences in personality would be more significant than the obvious physical difference. As such, I find it more pertinent to focus on diversity of opinion, personality, and culture, since that more directly fulfills the reason people ask for diversity, and more often than not takes care of the physical aspect on its own. It's that kind of diversity which is so well done in this game, as while it generally has the same tone throughout, the individual personalities and opinions of each character still shine through. For instance, Mort might be a floating skull, but instead of just being a gloom and doom undead character, he has a wit and personality to him that are not only intriguing, but genuinely funny at times. There's one moment in particular which stands out to me, where he ends up in an insult contest with a bitter young woman, and the result is as hilarious as you would expect. Of course, because of that wit and willingness to say what he feels, that can lead to some verbal clashing with your party members, which can also be highly amusing.
So, Fiendling, let me sit on your lap and hear a little story.
Oh yeah, you trying to sit in my lap, that'll make a grand tale. A short one.
I'll just float over here and sulk then. The only succubus ever to travel with us, and she's a Puritan. You know, I have the worst luck.
Your luck seems to blanket us all.
I'll say Hey, wait a minute.
Attention, Mort. Have we achieved a state of friendly camaraderie yet?
Go kiss a bear trap.
Maud, come on.
Trust me, Anna could use a kiss.
I don't want to go into too much detail on every character, but there's just so much variety to them, ranging from Morty and Dakan to an emotional young woman with some fiend in her ancestry, a literal succubus fighting against her nature, and so on. Despite that variance, all of them have something which gives them a degree of unity, tying into who you are as the Nameless One. Part of your blessing, or curse as the case may be, draws those who are in torment toward you, and each one comes with their own personal demon and struggles which they have to reconcile with. To my surprise, there was a huge amount of party interaction between each other and with the main story, but the problem is that said interaction came at the expense of there not being all that many possible party members. You can have up to 5 other people in your party, and you only really get 8 options, one of which is very hard to find without a guide. Part of me says that's a good thing, as given the nature of the gameplay, that means you're more than likely to have some of them in your party, which means more can be done with them. Another part of me, though, looks at Baldur's Gate and sees just how many possible party members there are, and wonders if there's a sweet spot between all the options and not all that many. For me personally, it's not a huge complaint, as I tend to find one party I like and stick with them for an entire game, but it does reduce the replay value should I ever want to return. Especially given that, to my understanding, the development for this game was somewhat rushed. I'm still satisfied with what I got from my party members, but just don't walk into this expecting to have all the party members. With all that talk about said party, I've spent a surprisingly small amount of time on the main character, and part of the reason for that is because he straddles the line between a blank slate for you to take on and a character in his own right. It's possible for memories to return when prompted by certain events, so we get an idea as to who the Nameless One was at one point, but apart from that, he really is what we make of him. In fact, the game recognizes this through how the alignment system is handled. For those unfamiliar with D&D's alignment system, it acts as a sort of moral compass and basic overview of someone's personality, which is measured by 2 different metrics. One of these is good versus evil, the other law versus chaos. To give an example of how the system works, a chaotic good character is your average vigilante, a lawful good character your righteous warrior, lawful evil a greedy businessman, and so on. As you play, the Nameless One's alignment will change depending on your actions, which is a clever way of handling his alignment and is really helpful for anyone starting out with CRPGs. For pretty much every game like this, there's usually a ton of character setup that you have to go through, but because there isn't much you need to worry about initially, it's easier to ease into what a CRPG entails. If you've never played one before, this is the one to start with. However, if you were in that circumstance, there are a couple of things to worry about. Perhaps the biggest issue is with the main plot itself. For the most part, I have very few complaints regarding it, and even though I carefully measured out how much I played so as to not prevent the game from consuming my life, I was still able to follow what was happening. Things that were said at the beginning of the game ended up having ramifications for the story throughout, which was really cool to see, and going back to look over the footage I recorded was really satisfying as a result. As a world for you to explore in, this game is unparalleled by anything that I've played. Unfortunately, I'm not the kind of person who goes into a world to explore, but rather to see what the main story has to offer. I did do more exploration than I normally would because the world was so well developed, but the main story, while interesting, is full of all sorts of contrivances that seem to only exist to force you to explore. For instance, here is what I had to do to find one character that was key to the main story. First, you have to know to look for this character, which in order to get that hint usually relies on Mort being in your party, getting him captured so that you can bargain with his captor to both get him back and to learn about yourself. From there, you go to a specific place, talk to a specific person, join the club that is based at that specific place, all to go to a specific point in that specific place to get the information you need. Then you have to talk to someone there to get the information to lead you to place number 2 after you've appeased said person with a specific item that you need at place number 3 in the same part of Sigil. In place number 2, you then have to find the right person to talk to, which leads you back to place number 1, only to be sent on another errand to run to place number 4 to get something for him so you can get information from someone in place number 2. Confused yet? Good, it gets worse. Then we have to help someone in place number 2 with their problems by running back and forth between places number 2 and 3, only to find that we have to twist someone's arm in place number 2 to get something we need to find the person we've been searching for this whole damn time. But that's only one part. Then we have to go pick something up in a completely unrelated part of this region, only to go to another part of Sigil to pick up a different item with what you got originally, identifying that with the spellcaster, which then allows you to get to where you need to go. Throughout that entire description, you find yourself going to all but 2 locations in one of Sigil's regions, and in case you can't tell, playing hard to get might seem interesting at first, but then it gets annoying to the point where I want to stop being Mr. Nice Nameless One and start killing people! In the game's defense, the purpose of all of that was to encourage me to explore, as said exploration and my interaction with the world is where the game shines the brightest. My biggest counter-argument to that is simple. If you have to force me to explore, then that betrays either a lack of faith in either the game's design or the player's agency. Quite simply, you don't have to make me do it. The game already has a lot to offer to where I, as someone who tends to focus on the main story, spent more time looking around than I normally would, even in a comparable game like Baldur's Gate 2. The world that was crafted stands on its own legs well enough to where you don't have to make me chase after breadcrumbs to get me to explore. I'll do it on my own accord. In fact, I stumbled onto the first few steps in the chain I recited because I was freely exploring and just enjoying the world. And forcing me to look around or look stuff up online to get to what I really want to do is only going to make me feel irritated that I have to jump through another one of your damn hoops. If you like exploration, this will be the game for you. But if you want to get to the meat of the game, then you're going to be frustrated at more than one point. The second thing that new players to CRPGs will want to keep an eye out for are the attribute checks. For the uninitiated, tabletop RPGs aim to create interesting worlds and provide a tangible measure for who your character is and to track their progress as they change and improve. At the core of this are your attributes, which control pretty much all of the statistics taken care of by the game's backend. Strength affects how much you can carry and how hard you hit, dexterity affects hand-eye coordination, constitution affects resilience to attacks and other adverse effects, intelligence affects your ability to learn, wisdom affects common sense, and charisma affects your personality, appearance, and ability to lead. Ordinarily, these are mostly relevant in terms of combat, which usually leads charisma to be the neglected attribute for many who are playing a game solely to be the ultimate fighter. However, these attributes also have an effect on your ability to handle situations outside of the combat, such as your ability to catch someone before they run away, handle certain attacks, and so on. From a story perspective, this is a good addition, as characters in media are compelling because of their strengths, and easier to connect to by their weaknesses. Too much of the former leads to a Mary Sue, and too much of the latter leads to someone who we find pathetic and don't really look up to. What makes the attribute checks cross a line for me is the manner in which they were handled. In a normal game of D&D, this sort of thing is handled by dice rolls that are either advantaged or disadvantaged based on your attributes. In that case, the human controlling the backend and the random nature allows what would otherwise be a limited system to generate a bit of tension and hilarity, which could then be told as stories later on. In this case, since it's a computer controlling the game, there's no elements of randomness. You either have the required attribute, or you don't. Because of that, you end up with a limitation built on top of a pre-existing limitation. What really irritates me though is that your wisdom attribute is directly tied into your ability to regain memories, which means if you don't dump a ton of points into that, you're going to learn less about the Nameless One, and you're going to miss out on some things as a result. How much you miss out on, I cannot say, as I did find out about this before I began playing. But with the limitations I've already mentioned, I can't help but feel irritated whenever I think about how this was handled. I find this perhaps even more frustrating due to the way the ending is handled, but in order to go into further detail, I'll need to venture into spoiler territory. If you have any intention to play this game, please use the annotation or timestamp to skip away now, as there is a lot that is worth seeing for yourself. If you didn't skip away, here's a brief summary of the ending. As you progressed, you found that you were mortal at one point, and had asked an unsavory character to help take away that mortality. This came at a price, however, as whenever you die, someone else dies in your place, leaving behind a shadow which is now going to be interested in destroying you. After discovering this, you eventually find yourself face to face with your mortality, which has taken on a life of its own that seems dedicated to keep you in a perpetual state of ignorance. At this point, if you found a way to forge a weapon that can kill you permanently, you can threaten this being to rejoin you. Or if you didn't find that weapon, you will need to fight and destroy him. Regardless of what you do, you find yourself sent to a plane where a deadly war is being waged between groups of evil creatures, there to atone for something which your first incarnation did long ago. I'll admit that when I first reached the ending, I was disappointed, with a great deal of that disappointment stemming from my expectations. Though I do have my complaints, everything leading up to that point had been good from a story perspective, and I was interested to see how my actions would shape the overall ending. Unfortunately, though many of the events leading up to the ending were really good, being thrown into the aforementioned war zone was jarring because I had no context for it. Had I found the weapon, then I would have had the reason indirectly explained to me. Had I figured out how to use a certain item, which contained the memories of the first incarnation, I would have understood. When I step back and look at the ending, then objectively speaking, the only real complaint is that it relies on multiple paths to a single end, and that the attribute checks are used even here as well. Worse yet, the rushed development meant that while I had seen music for a good, bad, and indifferent ending while downloading the soundtrack, I didn't know that there wasn't enough time to include them, which led to even what I know now feeling incomplete. It's a real shame too, because leading up to that point, there were so many thought-provoking and awesome moments that the ending just felt flat to me. Morty and Anna bickering, bargaining with creatures both evil and good, learning all that I cared to about this interesting setup, so many good moments and interesting things to see, and then something which didn't really meet my expectations. Honestly, while it does make sense from a storytelling perspective how it worked out, it's hard to dissociate from my first impression of it, and it's something which does sour the game for me, if only slightly. I haven't spoken much about gameplay just yet, but before I do, let's cover the overall look and feel of the game. I've mentioned the world building already, but more specifically, I want to mention how compelling the art style is. The graphics themselves are certainly limited, especially given the small resolution, but as mentioned earlier, the game knows how to, for the most part, get around those limitations. The art style is one which I'm not sure how to describe apart from showing a ton more of it. It's a very dirty look, with a lot of rust and dust and overall gloom, which gives just enough unease to be compelling, but not enough to overshadow the characters when they want to be awesome. The music though is where the atmosphere truly shines. At first I didn't care much for it, as the music you hear in the mortuary is a little too creepy for my liking, but holy crap, the rest of the music is so good that it completely wiped away my first impression. Though the atmosphere stays fairly cryptic, the music was able to get a far greater emotional and tonal range than I expected. To put it in terms that sound less high school band student, the music manages to keep a similar theme while it's also able to be solemn, epic, creepy, sad, or whatever emotion it needs to express. It's just the perfect arrangement that I can think of for a game like this, and it accentuated everything really well. For instance, when there was actual combat, the music made it feel a lot more epic than it actually was. So let's talk about said combat. For those of you unfamiliar with CRPGs, the combat occurs in real time, and is focused around dice rolls and what you can do to make your dice rolls more likely to work out. The main distinction from character to character are where they excel, which is denoted in this game by one of 4 classes. Fighters are effective warriors who focus on being in the front and murdering everything. Thieves are a stealthier bunch, preferring to strike from the shadows and disarm traps in the way of your progress rather than fighting in the open. Magi are magic users who cast spells that are, for the most part, focused on causing your enemies harm. Finally, priests focus on healing and buffing themselves and their allies, though they aren't afraid to throw some of their own magic around either. There are variants depending on the campaign setting you're using, but for our purposes, that's how they're defined here. The Nameless one starts out as a fighter, and depending on interactions with your party members and other characters, can become a thief or mage at will, or revert back to a fighter. In fact, when that interaction occurs within your party, it can often be beneficial for both you and your instructor, as you may end up teaching each other things that you learn along the way. Outside of combat, the level of your characters is going to play a role in how many hit points they have, spells they can use, and so on. As you fight monsters and interact with the world, you will gain experience that is shared among your party, with your wisdom attribute determining how much experience is required to level up. Upon leveling up, your class and attributes determine what benefits you get from it. Fighters improve their combat proficiency, and thieves get to improve their chance of success with various thieving skills, such as picking locks and hiding in shadows. Magi and priests get to increase the number of spells that they can use in combat, as while you can have a number of spells in their respective spellbooks, there is a limit to how many you wish to use before you need to find a place to rest. Just bear in mind that leveling doesn't happen very often, so it's not something you have to worry about too much. When you're actually in combat, the damage is determined by the weapon or spell you are using, which rely on dice rolls. The first number determines the number of dice being used, and the second determines the type of die. For instance, a 1d10 roll uses one 10-sided die, while a 2d4 rolls two 4-sided dice. The distinction there comes down to whether you want a higher edge case or a more reliable weapon. From there, combat can be rather complicated, as there are resistances to weaponry and magic to keep track of, savings throws which are used to determine whether certain effects will happen, armor class to determine the likelihood of getting hit, and so on and so forth. If you want to know more, the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rule set should be easy to find, as that is what the Infinity Engine was based off of. Just bear in mind that tabletop RPGs are turn-based games instead of real-time, and likely use slightly different rules than this game does as a result. Honestly though, I'm not sure you really need to know much about the underlying systems within the combat, simply due to the nature of the game. Once again, I find myself having trouble coming up with things to say because my opinion on the combat is just meh. It's functional, does what you would expect it to, and that's about it. The majority of the experience you gain is acquired through talking with others and taking care of non-combat problems, and there were large portions of the game where I ended up just not fighting at all. That being said, whenever there was combat, it was had in spades, so it's not as if there wasn't any combat to speak of. It's just that the story was really the focus of the game, and the combat purely there as an obstacle when going through unfriendly areas. In fact, even when it's focused on the gameplay, there are still influences from the story. Since that there aren't that many party members, and some of them can have huge impacts on the main plot, they effectively encourage you to have them around through their ability to fight. Mort, for instance, is really hard to hit and has a ton of resistances to all sorts of stuff, due to the fact that he's just a floating skull. To add further insult to injury, his jaw is his biggest weapon, both literally and figuratively.
Stabs pain into my eyes.
Yes, you can taunt enemies by insulting them so much that they just have to kill the obnoxious skull. Having him around is invaluable, which means he'll be around to influence the story in the way the developer wants him to. With all of that said, the combat certainly was informed by the story, but it does still work out anyway. Depending on how quickly you move through the game and how much you explore, it will vary in difficulty, but for the pace I took, it wasn't too hard. The only difficulty was in figuring out how to exploit the special abilities of my party, which at that point the combat still maintains a degree of challenge, but isn't something you'll worry about too much. Unfortunately, the user interface was, again, designed with giving the characters a little more personality instead of being practical. And whenever I was in combat, I was definitely wishing I had the old Baldur's Gate UI instead. To be fair, said UI did cover up a fair amount of the screen, and for a game with a 6400 by 480 resolution, you do want to show as much as you can with what you have. However, their answer to that was to compress most of the useful functionality to this corner into a pop-up menu when you right-click on the screen, which means it takes a lot more clicking to get to the spell or action that you want a character to take. Fortunately, you can click in between characters once the pop-up menu is there to give orders more quickly, and the pause feature does make it easier to plan how you want to engage, but it's still an unnecessary nuisance. Perhaps even worse, and the main reason for my overall indifference, is again an issue with the story clashing with the gameplay. Outside of the very last area, the Nameless One basically can't die, and due to both that and learning how to raise the dead before leaving the mortuary, there's simply no stakes to the combat. If I end up losing half of my party or going down myself, that's okay, I'll just resurrect whoever went down and charge back in to finish off the stragglers. There are story ramifications for the Nameless One's deaths, but you don't find out about that until most of the way through the game. And when you do, it's a drop in the bucket compared to what your previous incarnations have already inflicted. The good news is that, at least for me, the game doesn't overstay its welcome. I spent about 30 hours with it, but depending on how much you explore and how efficiently you do so, you can knock this out within 20 or 40 if you so desire. Honestly, I was kind of surprised by that fact, since I had heard that CRPGs can span over 100 hours if you so desired, but knowing in hindsight that the developers were pressed for time makes it understandable. It also makes the idea of playing through a second time more bearable, if you want to see how things might have turned out differently for various quests. Though the ending does somewhat consolidate into a very narrow range of outcomes, there is a ton of variance within the world, and the game as a whole lasted as long as it needed to. Overall, Planescape Torment is the most well-written game, if not piece of media, that I've ever seen. Everything is so well designed and thought-provoking that it's easy for me to overlook most of my complaints. There are still issues with the game, such as the combat having no stakes, the impractical user interface, and the path to the main story being contrived as hell, but this game is officially what I'm going to point to whenever someone says video games can't be art. If you've never played a CRPG before, this is the one that you should start with, and I heartily recommend it to anyone with even a passing interest. If what I've said sounds like something you can enjoy, you can find it over on GOG. And now we come to the question which many who have played this game might expect an answer from me on. Is this the best RPG ever made? Honestly, I'm not at liberty to answer that, as the term RPG has such a wide range now that it's really hard to judge based on the everything, especially given my love of Diablo-style games in particular. So instead of focusing on that, let's just compare it to the CRPGs that I've played thus far. To start off, is it better than Baldur's Gate? Absolutely. The original was handicapped due to developing the Infinity engine alongside it, and I have not made my disappointment at said limitations a secret. It's still a decent game, but it certainly doesn't hold a candle to what Planescape Torment had to offer. But now we come to the million-dollar question. Is it better than Baldur's Gate 2? Honestly, they're really close in my mind, as they're both very good for very different reasons. Sure, both of them are time vampires, but their focus is on different aspects of the RPG, and it's hard to compare them as a result. Planescape Torment focuses on being a thought-provoking, awesome world, with plenty of characters and interesting ideas to work off of. At its core, it's a journey of discovery, both of yourself and of the world around you. Baldur's Gate 2, on the other hand, got the self-discovery aspect wrapped up with the first game, and instead focuses more on being a traditional adventure, offering more robust and engaging combat and including a more overt hero-villain dynamic. Most people would say that Planescape Torment's story is better, but while the quality of the writing is certainly better, I'm not sure about the stories themselves. It's certainly an intriguing story, but Baldur's Gate 2 is a lot more personal, starting out with someone who is openly messing with us throughout the game, giving us a real motivation to find that jerk and beat the crap out of him. The endings of both games were fairly similar, but I walked away far more satisfied from Baldur's Gate 2 because of the payoff of taking down the big bad that had been actively hounding me. Of course, both have great characters with a lot of diversity between them. Planescape Torment has more well-developed party members, but Baldur's Gate 2 has overall more of them, each with little eccentricities here and there. And as much fun as Mord is, nothing beats giant miniature space hamsters. Of course, said hamster isn't nearly as useful in combat, but at the same time the combat is more interesting in Baldur's Gate and there's a lot more of it. Honestly, I could go back and forth on both of these games for the next hour, but if you held a gun to my head and forced me to choose, here is what I would say. As an RPG, Planescape Torment is probably superior, but as a video game, I will always choose Baldur's Gate 2. For what I enjoy from video games and for what I play them for, Baldur's Gate 2 does a better job of meeting that, and while I respect those who think Planescape Torment is superior, I would like to politely disagree. That's not to say that Planescape Torment is bad, however, as I would put both of these games in my top 5 favorites of all time. The fact that I can go on for quite a while debating what each one got right and not so right is tribute to just how good both games are, to where the question comes down to whether you prefer diamonds to amethysts. Whichever one you prefer, you've still got a good game that you enjoy, and I'd be crazy to try and take that away from you. Unless you think the fact that I prefer Baldur's Gate 2 somehow hurts you, in which case you've got bigger problems to deal with than one guy's opinion on the internet. That's all I have from this video, thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for the next game in Through the Looking Glass, as well as other content posted on a not-so-regular basis. Phew, I forgot how time-consuming CRPGs are. No wonder why I've been doing so many shooters lately. The irony is that I recorded this game for my second channel to ensure that it didn't consume my life, and now I'm complaining when it takes forever. Ugh. Hopefully I'll be able to manage my time better for the next one, as my understanding is that it does combat the best out of old-school CRPGs. So, I'm gonna go figure out whether that's true or not, and we'll see you all later.